So continuing through the brain, we've gotten through the cerebrum. Now we're going to get into a handful of other components, including the diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the limbic system. We're going to talk about the components we find in the diencephalon and what their functions are. We'll talk about the structures in the brainstem and their functions, the cerebellum structure and functions, and then we'll talk about the cerebellum and the brainstem and their relationship, and then get into the limbic system and talk about what they do. So let's start with the diencephalon. So di, we think two, right? So in N, we think inside, cephalon, or cephalo, we think head. So these are two things within the head. That helps you remember that. But this is a deep structure. We're underneath the cerebrum, so we're kind of like in the middle of the brain, so to speak. So we're covered by the cerebrum, and this is where we have the walls of the third ventricle. So we're really far in, and we're bordering that third ventricle. This is where we get information from the rest of the nervous system, and then send it into the cerebrum, with the exception of olfaction, so smell. We have a few components. We have the epithalamus. This is going to be the posterior roof of the third ventricle, so the back. And this is where we find the pineal gland. This is a little endocrine gland responsible for melatonin. We'll talk more about that when we get to the endocrine system, so we won't go any further than that with today. The thalamus, which is a pair of oval-shaped structures, and these have like a dozen nuclei in them, so we call it the thalamic nuclei. So you have a right and a left thalami. They're connected together by some gray matter, and this is called the interthalamic adhesion. Just below that thalamus, we have the subthalamic nucleus. This is going to be part of that basal nuclei. If we remember, we've seen this term, right? We saw basal nuclei, so we want to try to link those together. And so this is where sensory information can pass through before processing by the cortex. So we can kind of think of the thalamus almost like a bridge of some sort, where we're going to kind of like we're going to take information and then we're going to send it to the right area. So like when we're looking at the subthalamic nucleus, right, we're taking that sensory information and we're kind of, as a gateway, passing it through the thalamus to get to the right part of the cortex to be processed. And then the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, right, or low. So the hypothalamus, this is a bunch of nuclei that are involved in your autonomic nervous system as well as your endocrine system. It's also involved in your memory and emotion when we get into the limbic system, which we'll talk about at the end of this video. I like to think of the hypothalamus as the bridge between the nervous and the endocrine system. So we'll see the hypothalamus come back later when we get into the endocrine system as well. The brainstem, this is below the diencephalon and anterior to the cerebellum. This is what's going to then branch down and connect us to our spinal cord. And it also is part of what's called the reticular activating system. And this is what's helping control levels of wakefulness. Damage to the RAS can actually cause someone to maybe be in like a coma, right? If it's like severely damaged, someone could be like in a coma that they can't wake up from, right? So super important to be able to maintain wakefulness with the brainstem. And we think of the brainstem really does a lot of the bare minimum type of functions, like making sure your heart beats, making sure you breathe, right? Things like that. The really rudimentary stuff. I don't want to say lower level, but like the very basic stuff your brainstem can handle, but also very important stuff, right? If your heart is not beating, you're not really going anywhere. And so there's three main parts. There's a lot of text here, so I'm going to break them down point by point and just hit on some of the things we see here quickly. So there's three main parts of the brainstem, and they are in their order. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, right? So midbrain is the most superior of the three, pons is in the middle, medulla oblongata is down at the bottom there. Now, let's go into the midbrain first. So this is what's going to kind of help create the cerebral aqueduct. We saw that before, especially when we were talking about how the cerebrospinal fluid can flow through the central nervous system. We have the tectum, in which case we have the superior and inferior colliculi. These are these little enlargements. We'll see them on a picture in just a little bit. to see where they're located. They almost look like little swellings, little swellings, little enlargements in the back there of the midbrain. The substantia nigra, which we saw earlier, right, is going to be part of the tegmentum. And then if we go to the anterior side, we have the cerebral peduncles, and so that's going to connect the cerebrum to the spinal cord. And then the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum. Anytime you see peduncle, you want to think it's like a stalk, so it's something that's going to be like a stalk-like structure. It's going to connect two things together. This is going to help coordinate sensory representations when it comes to visual, auditory, and somatosensory senses, right, information. And then the pons is going to be mainly connected with the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle. And then the medulla oblongata, this is going to be the bottom one again. This is going to lead right into that spinal cord, right? On the front side, on the anterior side, we have the pyramids. This is going to have the motor projection tracts. Remember what tracts are? It's like a nerve, but in the central nervous system. And in the posterior end, the pyramids cross to the opposite side, and this is what we call the decussation of pyramids. There's also, when we look to the pyramids, we find a nucleus called the inferior olive. This is like a relay point for information on proprioception. Proprioception is kind of like is your sense of balance or your sense of space, your sense of positioning. And so that's going to go to the cerebellum because your cerebellum is going to be important for coordinating so that you can maintain a position. This is going to be connected through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So you'll notice we have a trend, right? So the superior cerebellar peduncles with the midbrain, the middle cerebellar peduncles with the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects to the medulla oblongata. The pons and the medulla oblongata together, these are the ones I'm really kind of talking about when I talk about your brainstem kind of being involved in the basic, just keep you alive functions, like maintaining your cardiovascular system, right, making sure that your heart is beating and whatnot, and that you're breathing, right, even when you're asleep. So here we see that sagittal section. We can see here, I'm just going to point out the big ones first. So there's the cerebrum, here's the diencephalon, and here's our cerebellum here, and here's our brainstem down here, right? If we look in the diencephalon, we see the thalamus right here, the epithalamus right behind it, where the pineal gland is going to be. And then the hypothalamus is right here. Now we see this little stalk coming down. That's going to connect us to the pituitary, and so the hypothalamus and the pituitary will be interlinked pretty tightly. And that's one of the reasons why I say it's kind of the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. But looking over here, here's the tectum in the back of the midbrain. We have the superior and inferior colliculus, or colliculi if we're talking about both of them together. So you see it's like a swelling here and a swelling here. Here's the pons, we see it's kind of this large oval-like structure here. And then the medulla oblongata is like another little kind of swelling down here before continually joining down to the spinal cord. So not too crazy of a picture, not too crazy of structures. The next one's going to get a little bit hairy though, because we're looking at the inferior end here. And so we're kind of looking at, so if we're looking at the midbrain, we're looking all the way up here. There's that pituitary gland that was kind of cut away in the last picture. Here's that cerebral peduncle. It's going to connect the midbrain to the cerebrum. Then when we get to the pons and the medulla oblongata down below that, here are those pyramids. We see it's kind of, kind of pyramid-like shaped, right? And then when we look at the cerebellar peduncles, we're going to get a little bit closer. And so in this case, right, we see the midbrain's been cut away a bit. Here's our pons, and then down here we would get to our medulla oblongata. There's the little olive, right, aptly named for the shape. But we see the superior peduncle, again, that's going to connect us to our cerebellum to the midbrain. We have the middle peduncle, which is connecting to the pons, right, and then the inferior, which is kind of coming down. We see it more than once, but it's coming down. It's going to connect us to that medulla oblongata. So we've been talking a lot about the cerebellum, but we haven't really talked about what the cerebellum is or does. Now, this is that structure that lays just behind the pons there. It's this kind of extra, it's kind of swelling. It definitely looks separate from the cerebrum. And the whole point of the cerebellum is to coordinate movement. So when you need to do something that's more of a complex movement, think like walking. When you're walking, you're not just moving one body part, right? You're changing where your weight is distributed, right? From one leg to the other. You're picking up, maybe pushing the weight onto the ball of your foot as you try to take a step forward. You're picking up the opposite leg, right, to move the leg out in front of you. Your arms are swinging opposite of how your legs are moving. Then you put that foot down so that the weight is on your heel, and you shift that weight from the back foot to the front foot, right, as you step. And you're constantly doing this, right, over and over and over again. And maybe if you're walking on ground that is like maybe bumpy, maybe you're going for a hike, maybe you're walking on gravel, right, you're not only having to just make those movements to go forward, you're also having to make small adjustments to maintain balance, right, to maintain your posture and maintain your gait, right, maintain how you're walking. So the cerebellum is helping you pull all these small movements together to create the one big movement, right? So all these little movements of shifting the weight, picking up the leg, moving the arm, right? All these things coming together to create the movement of walking. The cerebellum does have a similar setup as the cerebrum in that we have an outer layer of gray matter and white matter on the inside. The outer layer of gray matter is called the cerebellar cortex. So similar to how the cerebrum have the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum has a cerebellar cortex. The difference here is that the white matter on the inside is called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. And we'll see why it's called that in just a second when we look at the picture, because it really does look like a tree in all of its branches. And then deeper to that, we're getting even further in, we have the cerebellar nuclei, similar to like how we had the basal nuclei elsewhere in the cerebrum. The cerebellum does have folds in that cortex that are called folia, so rather than calling them a sulcus or sulci, we have folia. And then there is a midline region that we call the vermis, and then we have two cerebellar hemispheres, and we're going to see that in a picture just in a second too. So here we've cut away part of the cerebellum. So we see this is the white matter here. So like all of this, it's not color coded, I wish it was, but everything on this kind of exterior, that's going to be the cerebellar cortex. And then deeper in, right, this is where we see, it almost looks like a tree, right? Like here's the trunk and here's all the branches coming off, all the little twigs, right? That's why we call it the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. And we could unroll, right, if we were to unroll this. So here we see, like, this is just how it's set up, right, in the brain under normal circumstances. This is the unrolled cerebellum, meaning basically, like, if you think of the regular cerebellum as it is kind of like a rolled up, like, burrito. The unrolled cerebellum is like if you unrolled the burrito, like you took the tortilla and you rolled it out to reveal the insides. That's kind of what we're doing over here on the right. But what we see is this middle area is the vermis, and then the hemispheres, right? There's a left and a right. Lastly, we have the limbic system. This is a collection of structures that we find in the cerebrum and the diencephalon that are involved with specific activities, including emotion, motivation, and memory associated with emotions. And so there's a few main components that are recognized in the limbic system. The cingulate gyrus, this is located in that longitudinal fissure, right? So that one that lines the entire cerebrum from front to back. This is going to be just above that corpus callosum and is surrounding, it's kind of over the top of the diencephalon. The hippocampus, which is a little nucleus of, remember those gray matter nuclei that are, it's shaped like a seahorse, and the amygdala, which is connected to the hippocampus. So if we look at what everything is, right, so here's the cingulate gyrus all over here. See, it's kind of enveloping everything else, and then we have the hippocampus here in this purple, right? Kind of wrapping all the way around like a little seahorse. I guess if you squint, you can kind of see a seahorse. And then the amygdala is this little cluster that's down here. It's going to be right down there on the end of the hippocampus.